Today is Friday, January 28th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today is the memorial of St. Thomas Aquinas in the church, so happy St. Thomas's Day to everyone. And in honor of St. Thomas, I'd like to take some time on my walk today to talk about modern science. I'd like to try and help Christians living in modern society understand what's wrong with the discussions that we have in modern circles with regard to modern sciences. I'd like to explain how modern science is misused by anti-Christian men and how Christians allow it to be used wrongly as it is. I'd like to explain what the modern sciences are actually useful for, and I'd like to explain how Christians, if they pursue a true Christian education, can actually be better equipped, better prepared to become the best scientists. So let's talk about modern science. In modern society, scientists are in many ways like bullies. A bully is a person who's not tough, but wants to look tough, wants to feel tough. And the way that he seeks to look tough or feel tough is by intentionally picking on people who he knows won't or can't fight back. The bullies look for specific kinds of kids who they know pose no threat, and those are the kids that they pick on. It's exactly the opposite of what real champions do. Real champions seek the best competition. The principle of sportsmanship is may the best man win. If you think about professional fighting, professional fights are organized according to weight classes, so big guys fight big guys, small guys fight small guys, and occasionally a fighter comes along who's able to take on someone in the next weight class. The weight classes are so significant that if a great fighter steps up, let's say a champion in one weight class steps up into a higher weight class, he rarely can win. The differentiation of weight classes is that significant. The same is true in a sport like wrestling. Not fake pro TV wrestling. I'm talking about real competitive wrestling, Olympic wrestling, collegiate wrestling. The teams are organized into weight classes. A 125-pound wrestler will wrestle against a 125-pound opponent. A 250-pound wrestler will face a 250-pound opponent. If a wrestler tries to go up a weight class, he'll rarely win. The importance of size is that significant, especially when the wrestlers are all well trained. And so in real fighting, in real combat sports, we see size is differentiated and respected among opponents. And men only compete against people who are their size. And not only that, but they compete in a certain way. A bully might sneak up on someone and push him from behind. A bully might sucker punch someone when he's not looking. In real fighting, a fight is scheduled, a contest is scheduled. There are rules for the fight. Cheap, cowardly acts are made illegal. If it's a boxing match, you're not allowed to kick. You're not allowed to punch below the belt. You're not allowed to trip. You're not allowed to headbutt. It's a boxing match, and you agree to fight according to the rules. If it's a wrestling match, you're not allowed to punch. You're not allowed to kick. You're not allowed to pick someone up and slam him onto the mat. Even in more violent forms of fighting, like the mixed martial arts fighting, you're not allowed to gouge someone's eyes or bite someone. There are rules. Cowardly, unnecessarily hurtful actions are forbidden. Bullies don't like those kinds of fights. Bullies like street fights, where they can sneak attack, where they can fight dirty, and so on. They can stick a pair of brass knuckles in their pocket. They can use a piece of pipe or a piece of glass to hurt someone. They don't sign up for the police force. They don't sign up for the military. They pick on people in the streets, in school, in a parking lot, in the mall, and so on. You can see the character of a bully, the kind of people that they pick on, and the way that they fight. I can happily say that I'm 46 years old, and I've never had a fight, a physical fight in my entire life outside of a sport or any kind of organized contest. I've never had anyone pick on me. I've never had anyone punch me or sneak attack me or trip me or do the kinds of things bullies do. One of the reasons was that when I was in middle school, I had an older cousin that everybody knew who was a champion heavyweight wrestler in high school. And everybody knew that if you mess with me, my cousin, who was a little bit crazy, would hunt you down. And so I walked the streets and walked the hallways as a 13-year-old with no fear of harm because of my cousin. And when I was older, when I was a teenager myself, and throughout life, I've just never been the kind of person that a bully bothers. But I know the kinds of kids that bullies pick on. I had a next door neighbor, for example, who was that kind of a kid, kind of a nerdy, shy kid, a nice kid. I used to play with him. But he was a nerdy kid, shy, wasn't very happy. His parents mistreated him a bit, didn't have many friends, and he was the kind of kid that bullies pick on. And he grew up and eventually killed himself because of the bullying. But in modern society, scientists act like bullies. And modern Christians are the nerdy, wimpy kids who get picked on. Now, they're not necessarily the nerdy, wimpy kids because they're actually nerdy, wimpy people. They're not necessarily nerdy, wimpy men. But it's an illustration, it's a comparison. And what modern Christians are in intellectual circles is what the nerdy, wimpy kid is in physical circles. They're not able to resist, and the bullies know that, and the bullies pick on them intentionally. And the bullies not only pick on kids that they know can't fight back or won't fight back, but they do so in ways that are not sportsmanlike, that are not virtuous. And this is what modern scientists do. The problem with Christians is that when a kid in school knows that he's a nerdy, wimpy kid, he tries to mind his own business and avoid causing trouble. He tries to avoid provoking the bullies. If he knows the bully is in a certain hallway at a certain time, he'll try to find a different hallway to get to class. He'll try to avoid the trouble, whereas modern Christians are deluded into thinking that they actually are tough guys intellectually, and they volunteer for these fights and line up for these fights and get annihilated. And modern Christians who want to pretend that they're tough guys, that they're actually intellectual strong men, what they do is they act, and they put on this act and pretend like they have an invincible confidence. And even though they are completely annihilated in discussions and arguments and debates, and everyone watching sees them lose and lose and lose, and just forfeit institution after institution, debate after debate, election after election, they just lose and lose and lose. The Christians believe that by continuing to pretend that they're winning, they actually are winning. And what the Christians do in modern society is they enter into these temporal, worldly disputes, business disputes, political disputes, social and cultural disputes, legal disputes. And when they enter into those disputes, obviously, they think that they're important. Otherwise, why would you fight about them? When they begin the dispute, they think and say that this dispute, this battle, is significant. But then in that battle they lose, and then what they do is they laugh and scoff at the loss and claim that they don't care if they lose. And when you watch the behavior of the modern Christian, you can find a very vivid parallel. If you've ever watched Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail, you would remember the scene where King Arthur is confronted by the Black Knight. And the Black Knight is ready to fight. He tells King Arthur that he may not pass, and he's ready to go sword against sword with King Arthur. And King Arthur proceeds to cut off his arm. But that doesn't slow down the Black Knight. He's still talking trash and warning King Arthur to watch out. And so King Arthur cuts off his other arm and then his legs, and finally the Black Knight is laying on the ground, or I think he's actually propped up on the ground, bleeding all over the place, no arms or legs. And he's still talking trash to King Arthur. And King Arthur realizes that he's a nut and simply walks around the Black Knight and passes by with his men as the Black Knight continues to mock him and talk trash and threaten him. It's one of the funnier and more vivid scenes in the movie, which is ridiculous, by the way. And yet that Black Knight has the character of the modern Christians who have lost just about everything and still walk around talking and acting like everyone needs to be on guard when they walk into the room. No one takes the modern Christian serious. No one is concerned about losing a debate with a modern Christian. They look at the modern Christian the same way that Arthur looked at the Black Knight on the ground. That's what's different between the modern Christians and the kids who are bullied in school. The kid who is bullied in school knows that he's not strong, knows that the bully can beat him up, and he tries to avoid trouble. The modern Christians just won't stop until they lose everything. And they imagine that whoever runs into the battle fastest is the bravest. And they just get annihilated. And just thing after thing after thing is surrendered and lost. And they just keep going. Now, what's wrong about the scientists is that the scientists know that the modern Christians are completely unprepared for these contests. The modern scientists, the anti-Christians who speak as scientists, they know that the modern Christians do not have a Christian education, do not represent Christian thinking, do not represent Christian philosophy. They know that the modern Christians are deluded themselves and completely unprepared for these contests. And if the scientists were respectable, they would refuse to participate in these contests. Just like a 250-pound wrestler would refuse to wrestle a 125-pound opponent. Or like when boys and girls fight. If a girl starts a fight with a boy, the only right thing for a boy to do is to walk away. I know some people may find that offensive, but that's because modern people are nuts. But there's a time to accept a challenge, and there's a time to simply walk away from a challenge. If scientists were honorable men, they would walk away from the contests of these modern Christians because they know that these modern Christians really have no idea what they're talking about and are not prepared for these discussions. But the scientists are not honorable people, and what they'll do instead is make a spectacle of these debates and contests. They'll not only agree to participate in them, but they'll actually organize them themselves and make them public, like a 250-pound wrestler making his match against the 125 opponent into some big public event, only so that he can humiliate the opponent, but more importantly, bully the audience, because the audience is more like the Christian opponent than like the scientist. The scientists know, although they haven't received the education themselves, they don't know the actual content of the education. The scientists know that the real masters of Catholic learning, of Catholic philosophy and so on, are not found in the pews or in the streets or at the universities. They know that. You'll never find a scientist challenging a Dominican to a debate. You'll never find a scientist challenging a Christian hermit to a debate on some moral question or some question of natural philosophy. You'll never find a scientist demonstrating that something written by St. Thomas Aquinas is false. You'll see these scientists always engaging with these nerdy, wimpy kids, beating them to a pulp in front of an audience and accepting the shallow and deceiving appearances of victory, knowing that they're not really fighting against the actual opponent, but against pretenders. And that's what's not honorable about modern scientists. You'll watch a scientist from some major university, head of a research department who's been working in the sciences for 35 years, accept a debate from some random Protestant weirdo and just make a mockery of him and pretend that he's making a mockery of the Bible or of Christianity, when in fact he's not even addressing the actual claims and teachings of Christian philosophy. Now here's what science does that's misleading. Here's how scientists abuse and misrepresent the natural sciences. Scientific experimentation can actually only do a few things. There are only a few uses for experimentation as far as learning truth about the natural world is concerned. And you're going to have to listen to this carefully because we're going to split hairs a little bit. The first thing that scientific observation can do, if there is a finite number of objects in a certain class, if there is a known finite number of objects in a certain class, a natural scientist can observe and examine those known objects, all of them, and after observing all of them, can make a universal statement about all of them, about the entire class. Because, like I said, there's a finite number. That number is accessible, and the scientist can examine every one of them through experimentation. So, for example, I have 10 children. I have a finite number of children. Let's say that someone wanted to accuse me of abusing my children. And they wanted to examine my children. And they wanted to look for the signs of abuse in my children. Well, my children are a finite number, and they are observable. And so, a team of doctors could bring all of my children in and examine them psychologically, physically, and so on. Let's just say that they examine my first child and they find bruises that show the signs of beating and abuse. And they could note that. Child number 1 was examined and showed signs of abuse. And they bring the second child in and they could look at the second child and say, okay, again, on this child we see bruises and signs of abuse. So that's 2. And then they bring in a third child and they see similar signs of abuse. They see bruises and cuts and so on. And finally, the doctor calls off the examination and says, that's it, that's all we need. All of the Michael children are abused. That would be false. The examination wasn't conducted completely, and a universal conclusion was drawn based on partial observations. That would be not necessarily false, because if the observation continued, maybe they would have found that all 10 children had marks and signs of abuse, but they didn't. They chose to examine only a sample, and based on that sample, jumped to a universal conclusion. They cannot do that logically. But that's one thing that scientists commonly do. What the scientists could have done is complete the entire investigation, examine all 10 children, and if they found that all 10 children had signs of abuse, they could verify the accusation and say it is true that all of the children have been abused. They may have found signs on 7 children, and they could say, we have found that 7 of the children have been abused. And that's all that they can say. The only way that they can make a universal statement is to examine every individual in a finite set of objects. If they do not examine every individual, they cannot make a universal assertion. If they examine 2, they can only speak of 2. If they examine 6, they can only speak of 6. That would be helpful, but there's a limit to what scientific investigation can do. And that's the point. Scientific investigation can only make a universal statement if the number of individuals in a class is finite, and if every member of that class is actually examined. That's one thing science can do. The problem is that in real life, in nature, the objects about which science intends to speak and make assertions are often infinite. Maybe not literally infinite, but they're infinite in the sense that there's no possible way to know the number of them or to examine them individually. And therefore, for any class of things which is not finite in number, where every individual is not able to be examined and investigated scientifically, science cannot make any universal conclusion about that class of things. And yet, science does this all the time. This is an abuse of the scientific method. This is a misuse of the scientific method, and yet Christians accept these conclusions all the time from scientists. They do so when it's in their best interests. If a Christian wants something to be true, he'll embrace a universal assertion made by scientists. He'll accept it and begin promoting it. And yet when he does so with short-sightedness, and he sets himself up for troubles that when they come, can't be resisted. And it's because the Christian didn't insist on logical exactness, but allowed a standard of reasoning to be accepted, which later becomes a means of promoting destructive falsehoods that no one can resist. Especially when you were the one who granted all the previous conclusions. Science cannot make a universal assertion unless the objects that belong to that class are finite and can be observed individually. So when we hear of a study where scientists examine a sample of things, they'll examine 400 dogs, 65 women over age 65, 3,000 infants in hospitals. They'll examine a sample of a class of objects. They will then draw a conclusion based on that sample, but they will apply that conclusion to the entire class. That is a logical fallacy. That's invalid reasoning. I don't want to say a logical fallacy. That's invalid reasoning. That is not reasonable. That conclusion may not be permitted. That is a false conclusion. A sample of a population, a sample of a class, even if every single member of that sample proved the assertion to be true, that assertion cannot be applied to the entire class. That is irrational. And yet Christians allow this kind of scientific reasoning all the time. Scientists cannot examine all of the individual members of most classes of natural things. So they take samples. And that's fine. That's all that they can do. And they run tests and studies on those samples, and they collect data from the results of those investigations, and that data is valuable. That data is valuable because it can be used to draw a couple of conclusions. First of all, anything that's found to be true of some of the members of a class can be asserted particularly of that class. So, for example, if we run tests to see whether or not having infants under heat lamps in nurseries in the hospital causes them to gain weight faster, and we test 1,000 infants, and we find that all 1,000 of the infants grow faster than normal under the heat lamps. What we can assert is the particular statement that says some infants under the influence of a heat lamp can gain weight more quickly than they would without a heat lamp. We can make a particular statement that's absolutely certain because we've examined it and we've proven it with a test. We can make a particular statement. That's one thing that investigating a sample can do. It can allow us to make a true, particular statement. Here's something else it can do. Another way that science is helpful when we're working with a sample. If someone has made a claim, if someone has made a universal claim, either positive or negative, if someone has made a universal claim, we can use a sample to put that universal claim to the test. For example, if someone made the assertion, the universal assertion, that all infants will gain weight faster if they are kept under a heat lamp in the nursery. If someone made the universal assertion that all infants would gain weight faster under a heat lamp, and we ran tests on a sample of infants, and we tested 1,000 infants and found that 4 of them did not gain weight faster. That test would prove the universal assertion to be false. And we would correct that assertion and change it from all infants to some infants. And in doing so, we would establish the truth by means of a scientific experiment. And science, in that way, would be useful. The same thing could be done for the opposite, a negative universal statement. If someone were to say, no child will gain weight faster under a heat lamp than without a heat lamp, we could test a sample, and if we find even one child who does gain weight faster, we would prove that universal negative assertion to be false. And we would correct it with a particular statement based on the evidence. And you can see that science can help us avoid false universal statements, what we might call hasty generalizations. Because we have to be careful with these things. Just because something may be true of all of the members of a sample does not prove that it's true of all of the members of the class. You can roll your eyes at that and say, oh, come on, give me a break. But no one who's concerned about truth would respond like that. And when someone does respond like that, it should be a red flag that makes us ask, why would someone not want to say what's true? Why would someone want to knowingly maintain a statement that's not true? That should be the red flag for Christian people. If a man understands that what can be said of a sample cannot be said of the entire class of things, if we know that a man understands that, but he insists on saying it anyway, that should be a red flag. We should want to know, why does this man want to say what is not actually true? That's not scientific thinking. Why would he have a need to go ahead and say that, knowing the experiment didn't actually prove what he's saying? Christians, if they were careful, they would never allow that kind of generalization to be made in the name of science. They would insist that we stick to what is actually true and not say any more or any less. So, the scientific method is extremely important in a number of different situations. Like I said, if the members of a class are finite in number and we can examine every single member of that class, we can make a universal statement. If something is found to be true of every single member of that class, or a universal negative statement if something is found to not be true of any member of that class, when all of the members of the class can be examined. I used an example from a false accusation and how science could come to the assistance of a person and prove that an accusation is false. Because the number of individuals of which something is asserted can all be examined to see whether that assertion is true or false. That's one way the scientific method can help us. But when the population of a class exceeds a number that can be examined, or when the population of a class is unknown, we have no idea how many there are. As soon as we know that the population of the class is unknown, or that all of the individuals in the class cannot be examined, we then immediately know that through scientific experimentation, we cannot make any universal statements based on experimentation. But if someone has made a universal statement about a class of things, we do not need to examine the entire population of that class. We can take a sample, and if we find even one individual that contradicts the assertion, we have disproven the universal assertion and force it to be restated as a particular assertion, changing it from all to some. That's the value, the true value of the scientific method. This, of course, leads us to wonder, why would we even need the scientific method? Because this seems to be just a simple matter of observation. This seems to be a simple matter of observation. Why would we even need any kind of formal scientific investigation? And the answer is that there could be times where the power of natural human observation isn't sufficient to test an assertion. The use of instruments that are not commonly available to all men, telescopes, microscopes, and so on, these may only be had in small number. They may be very expensive, and let's say one university might have a certain machine, a certain instrument. There needs to be procedures for how these things are done, how these investigations are pursued. In the case of forensic investigations or legal investigations, a process of examination would need to be documented. And so there is a formal process, a formal set of procedures that's necessary, and also because we'd like tests to be reproducible, therefore we'd like to know the exact procedures, materials, and methods that are used so the experiments can be reproduced. Maybe when circumstances change, or when more members of a class become available. We'd like to be able to reproduce experiments and make sure that no variables change so that we can compare results. So there is a need for a formal scientific method of investigation. But what modern scientists are doing is an abuse of the scientific method, and they are promoting ideas and doing things in the name of science that actually have nothing to do with science. And Christians, because they're too slow, too dumb, too short-sighted, too gullible to catch the scientists in the errors, in the sophistry that they work with, what happens is one false idea will be presented and the community will accept it. The community will begin to repeat it. The community will begin to take it for granted. And once that idea is taken for granted, the scientists can now use that idea as a premise to draw another conclusion. This actually has nothing to do with science. This is just sophistry. This is the kind of false reasoning that Aristotle and Socrates and Plato worked to free ancient society from. Modern Christians have allowed it to come back to full strength. The scientific method has been used as a front to push false ideas into society in the name of science. And Christians, for a number of different reasons, allow these messages and ideas to enter into Christian society and become accepted without any examination, so that they become assumed pieces of knowledge taken for granted, from which additional arguments can be built. And the next thing the Christian knows, he's 65 arguments deep into an issue. He's been granting these assertions all along, thinking that everything looks okay, because nothing that he personally cares about has been affected by them. And all of a sudden, the rope is yanked, and this gigantic argument is cinched together, and the Christian is trapped so deep into these false arguments that they have no way out. And what they begin to do, like the Black Knight, is pretend that it's okay to be where they are. They pretend that it's okay. Or they react in some way to this final conclusion, and they react in some superficial way to pretend that they're discerning, to pretend that they caught the error. But their entire life is contained inside this trap. And their little act, their little reaction on Facebook, or their little reaction at the dinner table lasts for a few days until they finally quiet down and just get back in line and wait for the next headline, for the next message, for the next release of information. And this is where Christian society's at. They're so deep in these arguments, they've granted so many false assertions over the past centuries, wandering away from the path of Christian philosophy step by step by step, indiscernible small steps, accepting things without any discernment, without any examination. They are so far removed from Christian philosophy today that they don't even know anymore what's up or down, left or right. They won't even read the Bible because they have no idea what it actually means, because they're told that you can read a verse in the Bible and the actual meaning of it is the opposite of what it actually says. You can read St. Paul write in the scriptures, A is not B, and by the time you're done letting people explain to you, you see that, oh, okay, A is B. And that's the state of Christian thinking today. Christians have no confidence that they can read the scriptures and that what's asserted in scripture as a matter of divine revelation to be received by faith because God has revealed it. Christians are persuaded that they cannot know the meaning of the words of divine revelation until the scientists finish their studies. Do you honestly believe that that's how divine revelation was intended to work? That God would give His people His own words revealed to them not by scientists and scholars, but by prophets and apostles, holy men, men who believed in God, who were moved by the Holy Spirit, men who today are in heaven in the presence of God. God chose to reveal His truth to holy men, not to scholars, not to secular men, but to His faithful people. Do you honestly believe that He revealed mysteries of the kingdom of heaven through prophets and apostles to have them sealed and locked away from Christian people by unbelieving scholars who have to explain them before Christians can believe what God has revealed. Do you honestly believe that that's how Christian truth and divine revelation work? How have we come to this place? The answer is that Christians have allowed anti-Christian men to misuse natural science and the scientific method to make assertions about things that science gives them absolutely no justification for making. And it just goes on and on with no limit. Well, we know that this is 8.6 million years old. Where is this evidence? Where is this evidence? If a student begins as a science major in a university, they begin learning things from a textbook. The textbook just asserts and asserts and asserts and asserts, whether it's biology or chemistry or physics. Assertion, 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 assertion. The student is rewarded for simply memorizing all the assertions, and this is done in the name of science. What I would like to know, and I ask this for anyone who works in any scientific field, at what point in the education of a scientist or a doctor or a pharmacist, at what point in their education are the assertions that they are memorizing and then using to answer questions, at what point are those assertions actually proven to the students to be true? Or are they presented to the students as established facts to simply be believed and reasoned from in all future questions and considerations? And if that's what science actually is, how is it scientific? What I ask scientific people every day is, if you make any assertion to me, I'm a philosopher, I'm not a natural scientist, I'm a logician and a philosopher. If you make any assertion to me that is not self-evident, I have to ask for proof. I have to ask you to prove to me that that's true, or I refuse to grant it as true. That's the whole point of reasoning. That's the whole point of proof and demonstration. If you make an assertion, I have the right to say, please prove that assertion to be true. And what I find day by day, month by month, year by year, is that people who claim to be followers of the natural sciences scoff at any request for proof. If they're asked to prove something that comes out of their own mouth, they act like bullies and pretend that the person asking for proof is actually crazy and unreasonable. And the truth is, they are unreasonable. They are, for some reason, asserting things under the authority of science for which they have no actual demonstrative evidence. And if you ask them why they insist on asserting things that they cannot prove and have never seen proven, they pretend that you are crazy. And that's just a bully tactic. That's just sophistry. If I claim that I believe that Moses saw a burning bush, and the reason why I believe that is because in my Bible it says Moses saw a burning bush, I'll be mocked because I accept that statement with no proof. And yet, people of science do the same exact thing 1,000,000 times and pretend that for them it's perfectly justified. But for a person who believes in a sentence in sacred scripture, it's crazy, superstitious fanaticism. This is what modern science does. And Christians don't hold scientists and people. I'm not talking just about scientists. I'm talking about anyone in your life who comes to you and makes an assertion about anything and offers no proof. We see this on both sides of the current COVID controversy. I say that listening to Christians and people, conservatives and liberals, argue about COVID and vaccines is like watching two drunk hobos fist fight at 2 o'clock in the morning. To listen to the ridiculous arguments on both sides, the anti-vax people with their completely unverified craziness, and on the opposite side, these pro-science, pro-vaccine crazies with their ideas, none of them have any evidence for either position that's demonstrative, and they just sit there fist fighting like drunken homeless people in the middle of the street. That's the state of Christian culture today. You pick your side. The way that it works is you pick the side that you want, and then you just assume it to be true and fight for it to the death, without ever having actually proven it true. You simply identify with one side, you declare that position to be the Christian position or the conservative position, and then you fight for that until you either die or run out of money or lose your job or get divorced or whatever the end might be of these controversies. I recently posted an observation of the fact that when Donald Trump was president and news of COVID came out, COVID was presented by Donald Trump as the China virus. It was a hoax. It was something that China invented. And the way that America, capitalist America, was going to defeat communist China was by putting the American capitalist machine into hyperdrive, Operation Warp Speed, to develop vaccines to defeat the China virus. The vaccines were a symbol of American capitalism, and the coronavirus was a symbol of Chinese communist malice, anti-American communism. As soon as Donald Trump lost the election, the whole narrative was changed. All of a sudden, COVID was declared to be not dangerous, and the vaccines were claimed to be a liberal, Nazi-like effort to take away our freedom And any attempt, any wearing of a mask or getting a vaccine was to give in to the influence of communist liberals in America. The same vaccines that were developed by the Trump administration when Trump was the president are transformed into some kind of Nazi communist mark of the beast as soon as Donald Trump loses the election. And these people will argue these things to the point where they are sick, to the point where they lose their jobs. That's how crazy modern Christian society has become. And the same is true on the other side of the debate. The same is true of the other side. You have these two extremes. To use the illustration that Erasmus used to use, he said it's like a drunk man trying to get up on a horse. He finally gets up onto the horse only to fall off the other side. And it's this drunk man constantly just falling from side to side across the horse. That's the state of this irrational, lazy, modern Christian thinking that does not wait to draw conclusions, wait to accept assertions until they are proven to be true. The only way that Christians are actually going to raise great scientists is by raising careful, truthful philosophers who work in the sciences. That's why ultimately the natural sciences depend on truly wise men. Men who understand the art and science of reasoning, men who understand and are careful to only assert what's true, who actually practice the scientific method within the limits of the scientific method. Those are the only true scientists. And that's why I'm hopeful that classical Catholic education will produce great scientists. They won't be like modern scientists. They'll be quiet. They'll be careful. They'll be patient. They'll only say what's true. They'll be accurate. They won't speak beyond what the actual evidence allows them to speak. And because they're careful to only say what's true, they will make more progress because their thinking is always exact and true, and it will lead them more efficiently to solutions to problems. So, that's how classical Catholic education relates to the modern natural sciences. I think I've made it clear what's destructive and deceiving about modern science. Not the sciences themselves, but how men use the sciences as a smokescreen to simply push new ideas into society and have people in society embrace them rather than examine them. And I'm not talking about the conspiracy crazies who just pick and choose what they want to call false. The problem with the conspiracy theorists is they'll be discerning in one topic and be completely undiscerning in another topic, but they're simply fighting for their own will. They're not actually thinking with any principles, and their lives and messages are full of self-contradictions. The conspiracy theory spirit is not what I'm promoting. I'm promoting the universal commitment to being careful to examine everything. Like St. Paul, I believe it's St. Paul, says, cling to that which is true and reject what is false, but examine all things. I'm not promoting one side against the other. I'm not supporting the liberals against it. I'm saying the whole entire way of thinking is false. We have to examine every issue every question, every assertion individually, and allow the truth to establish our positions. Not start with our positions and then just fight for them to the death stupidly. That's what modern Christianity has become. And it's why Christians, despite all of their fake confidence, are losing everything. Everything. Schools, the government, their own communities, their families, businesses, everything they're forfeiting while they high-five and pretend that they're all being faithful. The results of these positions should be red flags to us that we're wrong. And the only way that we're going to establish respectable Christian culture and respectable Christian thinking is when we're willing to put every assertion on the table, even our most cherished pet ideas, and examine them and ask, do I have proof that allows me to actually accept this statement? Until Christians actually become truthful, they're just as bad as the misleading scientists. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.